Good morning, everybody. I see people starting to fill up the Zoom room. Welcome to Coffee Hour. We will be getting started around 9:03. Just want to give everybody the opportunity to join us. Go ahead and let us know where you're Zooming in from. Go ahead and use the chat box and tell us who you are, where you're from, and your class here. If you have questions throughout today's Coffee Hour, you can use the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. And drop a question in there if you would like me to pass a question on to Susan for you. We'll be getting started in just a couple minutes. Seeing a lot of familiar names joining here on the Zoom for this morning's Coffee Hour. Wendy Egger from Benicia, class of 92. Elizabeth King from Seattle, Washington, class of 79. Elizabeth, good to see you. I don't know if you're actually in Seattle or if you're here in State College, but thanks for waking up for us if you're on the West Coast. And Dave McClung, also on the West Coast. Wow, we are really popular in the Pacific time zone today. Dave's out in Humboldt County. I see Krista Demmer from York, the treasurer of the York County chapter. Amy Llewellyn from California, Maryland, not to be confused with the other California, but Amy, thank you for joining us from the class of 2019. Jamie Culinary, class of 2005, Northern New Jersey. Great chapter leader for our Northern New Jersey chapter up there. Thanks for all you're doing up there, Jamie. And Dave Lucas from the pizza capital of the world, the 1996 graduate living in Old Forge, Pennsylvania. We are going to be getting started in just a minute. Thank you, everybody, for joining in. I see Mark Pabletti and Carol and Hareem. Welcome, Hareem. Good to see your name on here, class of 2020 from Virginia. Dane Zibnowski down in Philadelphia, class of 2005. Oh, I believe Las Vegas is Mountain Time, if I'm not mistaken. But John Schaefer waking up with us this morning, tuning in from Las Vegas. Grant Crampton in Arlington, Virginia, class of 99. Welcome. Wow. A lot of Alumni Council members. Ty Cole working at the Shenango campus. I see Peter Sheridan. Peter's become a regular on our coffee hours and on our virtual speaker series. Great to see everybody this morning. John Schaefer confirming that Las Vegas is actually on Pacific time and not Mountain Time. Thank you, John. Where else would you rather be than a Zoom full of Penn Staters? I'm Paul Clifford, CEO of the Penn State Alumni Association. Welcome to the Penn State Alumni Association's Coffee Hour. Each week on Coffee Hour, you can expect to hear the voices of Penn Staters talking about what they're passionate about. And you can expect to feel the pride and the power of the Penn State network. As a reminder, we are recording this session and we'll be sharing it with other Penn Staters so that they can be inspired by the stories that we share with you today. Failing at being disabled. Today, we're going to talk with a dynamic leader that has utterly failed at being disabled. I'm, of course, talking about Susan Robinson. Susan is a leader making an impact on the world in a truly unique way. Through her corporate and conference keynote speeches, commencement addresses, workshops, client initiatives, and writing, she masterfully blends 25 years of multi-sector leadership with her experiences being legally blind to shift thinking, elevate potential, and inspire action. I'm excited to welcome Susan to Coffee Hour. Welcome, Susan. Hey, Susan, you're still muted here. Sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, take two. Hey, Susan, welcome to Coffee Hour.
Thanks for having me. I'm really glad to be here. And it's great to have so many familiar names with us today, too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, the Zoom is packed with Susan Robinson fans. And so I'm really excited to get to this conversation. But before we get started, it's called Coffee Hour. But are you actually a coffee drinker?
I'm not a coffee drinker. I'll
Tea,
do a
right?
latte every once in a while, definitely tea. But today, because it's warm and it's summer, I've got seltzer water with a little cranberry juice.
All right. Well, let me brag about you for a second, and then we'll get into our conversation. Susan has worked with global firms and Fortune 500 companies, top not-for-profit organizations, leading universities, and the United Nations. Susan's adept ability to convey difficult and complex issues with approachability allows her to resonate with diverse audiences, including most recently the readers of Forbes magazine. Susan's an executive board member of the Penn State Alumni Association's Alumni Council and a board member of both the New York State Preferred Source for the Blind and In Tandem Cycling. And we're going to talk a little bit about In Tandem in just a couple minutes. She has a master's in public administration from New York University and earned her bachelor's of science degree in health policy administration right here at Penn State in the College of HHD. She holds minors in business and economics. Oh, I got to take a deep breath. She is a TED resident. She is the interim executive director of In Tandem and a renowned keynote speaker. Welcome to the show, Susan.
Thanks. That's
all right.
Yeah, take a breath. Makes a mama proud, though.
Absolutely, and I hope that your mama is on here and your dad. I know that they were planning on tuning in from the wonderful hamlet of Berwick, Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
A fellow Northeastern Pennsylvanian joining me on Coffee Hour. So let's start right at the beginning there. What's your Penn State origin story?
So I went to high school at St. Cyril Academy in Danville, for anyone of you who know it. And right across, sort of down the hill, across the street and up the hill was Geisinger Medical Center. And I was very involved with the Medical Explorers program that we had at that time. And I left high school with the intention on being an orthopedic surgeon. And Penn State was just one of those schools where it was a must apply to. Truth be told, Penn State was not my first choice. And my recollection of the story is that my parents said, you can apply anywhere you want, but you're going to Penn State. And I did apply wherever I wanted. And Penn State, to their recollection, Penn State was the first acceptance that I had gotten and received it quite early. And I said, well, they obviously want me, so I'm going to Penn State. And so I think those stories, though each of us doesn't remember the other story per se, I think they still work together. So that's how I landed at Penn State. And I came in the summer because there was a program at the time for incoming freshmen in the biological sciences. So I was one of about 40 students that came in for a month over the summer, and I was on campus maybe 3 days, and I said, oh, this is for me. This is amazing. I don't ever want to leave.
It was not the first choice, but it was the last choice and the right choice.
Exactly. Yeah.
Susan, while you were at Penn State, what were you involved in?
So I entered as a biology major, as I said. So early on, I was involved in like sciencey stuff and, making friends and kind of doing the things you do when you're a younger student at Penn State. I remember loving Be a Part from the start, though. I loved it as a freshman, so I was involved as a volunteer for the subsequent 3 years. And then when I changed my major to health policy and administration, feeling like I had some time to make up, I got involved in the Student Health Center and the HPA Club and the Student Organization for the American College of Healthcare Executives. So I sort of took a deep dive really quickly in getting started on my career.
Yeah, and then somewhere along the way, you received news that changed your Penn State experience. Would you share that story?
Sure. In the spring semester of my sophomore year, I was diagnosed with a genetic vision impairment that has no correction or cure. So when I came to Penn State, I remember being in Bio 101. It was in Schwab Auditorium. And I would sit in the front row and I couldn't get all the notes that the professor was writing down before they moved on to the next page of notes. And I kept saying to my mom, having worn glasses since I was 8 and then contacts since 16, I remember going to the ophthalmologist once a year. They check your eyes, you get new prescription lenses, and the world is clear again. So I kept saying to my mom, like, Mom, I can't see, I need my glasses changed again. And long story short, the diagnosis came that it was not a need for corrective lenses, but I had this macular degenerative disease. So for anyone who's familiar with macular degeneration, typically it's more common as an adult, but I have the adolescent onset version. So spring semester, March of my sophomore year, I was diagnosed, and I sat back and I said, well, if I can't operate in a hospital, I'll just operate the entire hospital, and change my major from health policy to health policy, and never looked back since.
So talk about how it was to navigate Penn State with this, not only the new diagnosis, but how it got progressively worse while you were here. Talk a little bit about how Penn State responded.
Sure. So from a diagnostic point of view, the retina cells that I no longer have any of, they just follow a pre-programmed death. Sort of like at a certain point you start growing, and your hair color is what it is, and your metabolism is what it is, and your eye color it's the same sort of thing. So there was just a genetic pre-programmed death of the cells. So little by little they were going away. And so I don't know the measurement from my point of diagnosis until I left Penn State, but I definitely needed magnifying glasses and other visual aids in order to help me read standard size textbook fonts and that sort of stuff. But the ADA was new at the time that I was diagnosed, so there was no Office of Students with Disabilities. There was no sort of general dialogue on diversity and inclusion like there is now. And so I just became a self-advocate. For me, the diagnosis just explained why my world wasn't what I was used to it being. I remember walking across the Hub lawn and I saw someone that I knew. That was my experience with it. So I called out, "Hey, Sherilyn." And as the person got closer, I realized it wasn't Sherilyn. And the person was looking at me very strangely, like, why were you calling me some name that I'm not? I also have a ridiculously fun story of mistaking an Asian man for my mother up at Beaver Stadium. So that's, it's all kind of weird, interesting stuff. But from an academic standpoint, I just went to my professors after I got the diagnosis and I said, "Hey, look, this is the deal. I can't get all my notes before you switch to move on. If you wouldn't mind making me a hard copy so that I could have to be able to follow along in class, where I could hold that hard copy closer to my face to be able to see it." Everyone was completely accommodating. I had no negative experience whatsoever. When I took the GREs, I worked to have a large print test in the time that I needed because I read much slower than everyone else just because of the ways my eyes process information. So I would say I had a tremendous experience with it at Penn State, and it set me up with a little bit of false expectation for what the rest of the world might do. But at Penn State, I have nothing but appreciation for an environment and everyone in it saying, "Okay, you're just as talented and qualified as everybody else here. We just have to do things a little bit differently. So what do we need to do to make that happen?"
So Susan, I want to get to your TED experience. I want to talk about in tandem cycling and what that work is like. But first, kind of walk us through the point from Penn State to when the TED experience happened. What was your career path like?
So I had a career just like anybody else, any other Penn State alum, kind of working their way through. So I left State College and came to New York. I entered into my master's program at NYU and also secured a position at the mayor's office at that time. So I did both for about a year and a half. After I graduated, I moved on to my first full-time job out of school at a specialty orthopedic and rheumatology hospital here in New York, and was responsible ultimately for a majority of programming for pediatric patients, for their parents, anything that wasn't diagnostic, I sometimes had a role in. I also worked across New York City with a lot of healthcare professionals in working with pediatric patients. At the time, managed care was a new concept and it was working its way east from California. And so we were trying to figure out, how do we deal with making sure of the most holistic possible healthcare process was offered to sometimes really complex pediatric patients, and how do we ensure the best possible outcome? So it was really a lot of work. I did worked a lot with medically underserved communities here in New York, and created some really incredible health networks with great professionals. So that was my first job out of graduate school. I then moved on to a national organization, the first time I had worked nationally, and it was a mobile medical unit program that provided a medical home to medically underserved and homeless children and adolescents throughout the country in both urban and rural environments. When I joined that organization, there were 15 of those mobile medical unit programs, some providing direct medical services, some tacking on dental services and social services, all done via mobile medical unit. We were doing electronic health record system at a time where that wasn't a commonly used process, and doing it in a mobile environment, which was really transformative in a lot of ways. And then Hurricane Katrina hit. And part of my role then for the first 8 weeks after landfall was coordinating these doctors' offices on wheels and clinical teams down to Biloxi, Mississippi, and areas in and around New Orleans and Baton Rouge, to ensure that people who had essentially lost everything not only had clinical care and the medicines they needed, but the support and other things that they needed as well. From that, I jumped into what now would be called a chief program officer role for a national voluntary health organization. And 2 weeks into that job, there was change at the most executive level, and it became an organizational turnaround project. So I often say, I've done disaster response that's both natural and man-made. And I was there for 5 years, and essentially with my colleagues on staff, with my team, and with members of the board, recrafted mission delivery for the organization so that it not only survived a really unfortunate time in its history, but thrived afterwards. And so for one example, we took education programs that initially were maybe engaging 2,000 people a year, and in less than 12 months time, we're engaging 40,000 a year. We did a lot of other things. It was a great team effort and really turned the organization around. From there, I got recruited over to the pharmaceutical industry and was responsible for building a public health initiative within a corporate enterprise, which was really interesting and fun. And we spent a lot of time, also a national role, spent a lot of time identifying patients and linking them to a cure, which was really impactful work and really meaningful. And at that point, I said, I like doing everything that I do, and it seems that people come to me quite often for advice. And so I decided to hang my own shingle, and I started a consulting practice. That's evolved a little bit over time, but it's what I do now. And then the speaking started about 5 years ago.
That's amazing. What a career of impact that you've been able to have on others. This is the Penn State Alumni Association's Coffee Hour. I'm Paul Clifford, and I'm joined by Susan Robinson, a TED resident and renowned keynote speaker. All right, Susan, in your own words, you have failed at being disabled. How has that failure led you to the TED stage?
So, as we talked about, I was diagnosed with my vision impairment at Penn State. And Penn State, not to make an eye pun, but Penn State didn't blink an eye. It was not a big deal. It was like, okay, you can't see like everybody else, no problem, we'll make it work, and that's what happened. For most of my career, up until a few years ago, how people managed in whatever the way they processed my vision impairment was really akin to someone being on crutches. You see someone on crutches and they're about to walk into a door, like into a building. Typically, somebody will pick up the pace a little bit to open the door for them to make it a little easier. So it's just, I would say, day to day, transactional accommodations. And that's what would happen for me. If I was the most senior person at the table and responsible for paying a dinner bill, someone would calculate the tax and the total, put a dark X, big X where I could see it, so I could sign from the body position that a 20/20 sighted person would do. I would get a little quick, just a little quick whisper in the ear about who might be walking towards me, because I can't identify them from a distance. And so I'd be able to say, hello, Paul, in a way that would be familiar behavior to someone with 20/20 vision. When I launched my consulting company, I had come back to New York full time from my pharmaceutical company role in Boston. And I was doing the business development and the networking, and I sort of got connected into the blind space. And there were two specific individuals that were very frustrating to me, considering all the experience that I had had and all the things that I had done professionally and personally. There was a CEO of an organization in the blind space, responsible for advocacy and leading the charge on needs and wants and what could be offered by individuals who are blind or have low vision. And as I was talking to him, he called me disabled. He was one of the first of two people to do that. And he started talking about his surprise that I had accomplished everything that I had accomplished. And I was used to, over my career, people saying, wow, how do you do that? And you're vision impaired. And initially my thinking was always like, oh, you silly, fully sighted people, you do the same thing if you were in my shoes. But now I'm talking to a CEO of an organization where he's interfacing with people who are blind or vision impaired every day. And he's saying the same thing. Wow, how do you do that and you're vision impaired? And that's rooted in surprise, which is to me unacceptable. So we got into a conversation because in my head, I'm thinking, of all people, you have a responsibility to reshape the narrative, and you're buying into the 20/20 perspective anyway. And because of your role, you're not only proliferating the misconception, but you're giving people permission to believe it because you're the CEO of an organization in the blind space. Concurrently, there was someone else who, just bless his little heart, for the life of him, he was so forceful and aggressive in his pursuit of my acceptance of the label disabled, and was completely unwilling to listen to logic, reason, or pushback ultimately. And at one point I said to him, okay, so you want to call me disabled, and I've been an executive leader, cross industry, I've traveled the world, I own my own apartment. Have you done any of those things? Which he had not. And so I sort of said, well, if I'm disabled and I've accomplished all of this, and you're not, and you haven't, what explains your deal? And I learned through some of those conversations that the so-called normal really doesn't like it when that sort of thing is pointed out to them. But it really got me into this space of, in many other situations, if someone is so forceful in calling you names or using something that you're pushing back to say, like, that doesn't fit for me. In many other constructs, that's called bullying. But in this particular situation, the so-called normal in the framework, the imposition is you're disabled and you're going to have to accept it because I decide whether or not you like it. And over about 18 months, I had had so many conversations like this and was increasingly frustrated at the lack of logic, the lack of courtesy, the unwillingness to have a broader conversation, that over dinner with a friend, I sat down and she said, how are you? Poor thing was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I was like, I'm going to tell you how I am. And I went on a complete rant that was just 18 months of built up frustration. And the whole thing ended with, you want to call me disabled? I'll tell you what, I fail at being disabled. And the words just came out of my mouth, and I sat back and I was like, that's a really good idea for a talk. Literally the next day, the very next day, a friend of mine sent me the application for the TED residency and said, you have such great ideas. Your consulting business would be really cool to put in as a TED residency application. And I said, oh, no, I've got a better idea. So I turned my rants that ended with how I fail at being disabled into my application for the TED residency. Ted said, hey, yeah, come join us. And 6 months after that dinner, I was on stage at TED delivering that talk.
On the same stage as Brene Brown, Malcolm Gladwell, Simon Sinek, Peg Heffernan, Dan Gilbert. What has that platform afforded you? What has the reaction been? What has life been like after being a star on the TED stage?
Well, that's very kind of you to say, Star. I think there are some really amazing TED speakers, and I'm just glad to be part of that family. It's a really incredible family, not unlike the incredible family that Penn State is. When my TED Talk was launched, it was featured on TED.com, which was an incredible recognition by TED. And around the world, the general consensus was that most of the feedback that I got fell into two camps. One was for people who felt like they identified with my experience, and the other was people who considered themselves so-called normal. And for folks who identified with my experience, oftentimes it was, thank you for giving me some words that I can push back to, or thanks for verbalizing this in a way that I can take to someone else to help them understand my experience. So I feel like it's created a lot of room in the world for everyone to bring their best talents and strengths forward and to be recognized for those talents and strengths, regardless of their packaging. For the so-called normal, I always put that in quotes, disabled, so-called normal. For the so-called normal, a lot of the feedback that I got was, thanks for allowing me to take a look at myself and how I unconsciously treat other people. It's really quick to infantize someone. I was actually talking to someone in London. He has MS and often uses a scooter for mobility. And there's mind the gap on the London tube for a reason. And so he was maneuvering his scooter off of the subway car, the tube car, onto the platform. And he told me the story that some woman rushed over to him to say, I can't stand looking at this anymore. I'm going to help you. And we talked about how that is an imposition. She gave no permission to the possibility that he had done it for 5 years, that he had a process, that it worked for him. It was her discomfort and anxiety that she then imposed, and then also identified herself as the only solution to the problem that she thought existed. And it's something that happens every day. So a lot of the so-called normal folks just were able to take a step back and said, I never heard someone share their experience this way before, and it's given me pause to let other people have the space to do things their way. And for me to just step in if I'm needed, and for someone else to define that need. In business, I often use my example as opportunity to define greater goals, goals that you can't imagine. I sort of start out my thing, and depending on the keynote or the workshop, I don't necessarily disclose that I have a vision impairment straight away. And so I establish my credibility because I have a career just like anybody else. And then I'll say, oh, by the way, I have a vision impairment, I'm legally blind, and I mistaken an Asian man for my mom. So if I see you in the hallway 10 minutes from now and don't recognize you, don't worry, it's not personal. And then they're like, wait a minute, what just happened? And that's very interesting for me to see, because I don't let them sit in that. I don't give permission to the unconscious bias. I've just given you all the credibility that you need to do my job today. If you're now questioning it because you think I have a vision impairment and that's not possible, that's really your issue than mine. I've already moved down the path about 2 or 3 minutes. And so people have to catch up and it becomes not a big deal. And it's not that people's needs aren't a big deal, but I think we all have them. I have hired and fired people. I've never fired someone because they're 20/20 sighted. People who are blind have a 70% unemployment rate, and businesses who hire, if it doesn't work out for whatever reason, oftentimes will never hire someone who has a vision impairment again. It's an arbitrary, like if it's not a right fit or someone's unwilling or unable to do the job, that's different. But just because someone is blind or has a vision impairment is not a predictor of best outcome. And if a job doesn't work out for someone who's like 6 foot tall, the company isn't saying, oh no, none of those anymore, just 6'1" and up and 5'11" and down. So I've been able to have some impact in some more broader ways by having influence on systems and decisions and decision makers within businesses to be able to acknowledge hiring practices or even just recognizing talent for what it is and what's needed. And the packaging on the outside is really secondary or tertiary.
You know, you just alluded to this, Susan, but you've been an advocate for people of all abilities. Can you share a little bit about how that advocacy work has opened up opportunities with the United Nations and recently being featured in Forbes magazine?
Yeah, it's, I think that the TED Talk, because it did so well internationally, and I'm so appreciative for that opportunity. This concept of failing at being disabled, it really it makes you think, like, what does that mean? What does it mean to be disabled? What does it mean to fail? What does it mean to fail at both? Most people say, how can you fail at being disabled? And it's really about the expectations of others. I go back to that conversation where I had with someone who had not been at executive level at business, who didn't have the same level or kinds of professional successes that I had had, who had not traveled the world independently, who didn't own their own apartment. And somehow I was disabled in this way that the tone of it was just so disrespectful. And I think that when I went to TED, they're always looking for ideas worth spreading. And to them, that was new. I still say those words now, and people find them new still, which is both good in some ways and unfortunate in others. But the work that I've been able to do as a result of the talk has given me increased perspective on what does it mean to be a good manager? What does it mean to be successful in the world? How do we build great teams? How do we transform businesses? Because if we're going to transform business, we need to take our best strengths and just use them in a different way or apply them in a different way. What's the same with people? How do we identify the best parts and plug them in where they need to be? Quite frankly, I use Penn State football as an example. We never have a wide receiver kicked off the team because he's not big enough or strong enough to be a center. And we never kick the center off of the team because he's not quick enough with fast hands to run down the field like a wide receiver and catch the ball. It's the diversity of skill set that builds that successful team that we all know and love. If the same thing were done in business, what could we actually accomplish? And I think some of that perspective and what I've cultivated over time, learning from my clients, learning from others, processing it and putting it into this framework that I've experienced that seems to resonate with a lot of people, opened up the door to a greater international audience, which has included the UN and as you mentioned, Forbes just a couple of weeks ago.
So let's shift gears a little bit and let's talk about what you're doing now. You just had a new project. Either you've accepted it or it was dropped in your lap. I don't know. I don't know if I should be congratulating you or commiserating with you, depending on some of the conversations that we've had. But you've recently stepped into the interim executive director role for In Tandem.
Yeah.
Can you talk about what In Tandem is and what your day-to-day looks like as its top leader, and how you've incorporated Penn State into that experience?
Yeah, so In Tandem is a New York City-based not-for-profit organization that provides free year-round tandem cycling programs to people who are blind, vision impaired, or can't ride a bike independently for other reasons. And you're alluding to some of the difficult conversations we have. Tandem cycling is not socially distant. So how do you deliver a mission that requires violation of COVID guidelines? Right. It's a challenge. And how, like many other not-for-profits, 66% of not-for-profits in the United States have been significantly disrupted because of COVID. And that includes In Tandem. We lost our biggest fundraiser in the spring. We've not been able to deliver mission in the way that the organization has done since its inception in 2013. We have a community that, living with blindness or being a person who has a vision impairment is challenging enough on a day-to-day basis, but a pandemic exacerbates the issue. If you have no usable vision, how do you keep 6 feet from someone else? Right. And in a heightened anxiety environment that we're living in, I know folks that are part of In Tandem who the general public, even if they have a cane and a service dog, will be yelled at by someone saying, "You're not keeping 6 feet from me," without recognizing that you're talking to someone who's blind and doesn't have the ability to manage the 6 feet. So the complexities of being vision impaired, adaptive exercise by and large is limited to begin with. So to tack on a pandemic that takes away maybe your only opportunity for physical well-being, physical engagement, not to mention any chronic issue is associated with depression and anxiety. And so In Tandem, what we learned actually when we had to pause the riding season back in March, we learned that yes, we were delivering on the physical well-being piece in a way that we recognized. I mean, some of us are riding 1,000 miles a year or more, which is really incredible. But we also were a place of social well-being where people could get out of the house and have a place to go that really was built for their needs and their abilities and the way they worked in the world, which layers into sort of the mental health piece too. And so what we've done is taken things virtually, which if you would have told me 8 months ago that the blind population would take to Zoom just like everybody else, I might have raised an eyebrow. So we've shifted to virtual format for a lot of things. We think we've figured out a way to mitigate as many possible risks of COVID transmission that we possibly can to have a very limited but still open riding season for the rest of this year. And we're kind of working on that. And also figuring out how do we be creative in a fundraising environment when we lost our signature fundraiser, and what can we do between now and the end of the year to leverage the assets that we have. And so I'm figuring out new ways to deliver mission. Yes, we are a tandem cycling program, but we're doing it for people who exist in the world differently than the average person. And how can we not only be beneficiaries or recipients of something that's adaptive and helpful and addresses the physical, mental, and social well-being needs, but how do we then also pay that forward and engage with others and give in a way of service in addition to sort of getting those services ourselves? So the day-to-day is try to manage all of those moving parts and put them together as quickly as possible. In order to do that, this summer I have 7 health policy and administration interns. One of them you mentioned, Hareen Beg, is on with us today. And they have helped in all areas of business. I'm so proud of them. They have all risen above their station and delivered fundraising, prospecting, grant writing, working on special events that are fundraising in nature for In Tandem. They've developed a 6-month social media strategy. They've developed communication responses for a variety of different scenarios. They've interviewed next semester's interns. They've written job descriptions. They've built the construct framework for a junior board. They have helped to figure out what a virtual program, virtual mission delivery could look like. They figured out how to maximize those opportunities for mission delivery. They have been incredibly impressive. And as they all know, I've been bragging on them every possible chance that I get. But what we've also been able to do is bring in Penn Staters during their internship experience to talk about subject matter expertise like development and fundraising and social media, for example, and leadership, which has been terrific. And then also as part of In Tandem, I've been working with the New York City chapter. I sit on their advisory board, and we're beginning a joint partnership. I don't know if that's maybe not necessarily the right words, but just a connection between the New York City chapter and In Tandem for increased volunteer opportunities and other things. So the power of the Penn State network is really in full force with In Tandem, and not only does In Tandem really appreciate it, but as a Penn State alum, it's a great joy and honor to be able to have so much of a Penn State influence on things that I do day to day. It really makes some of the work, especially during a global pandemic, which can be very difficult, much more enjoyable and really rewarding, knowing that I've got just a team of folks that we all want the whole thing to succeed.
Susan, you've been a commencement speaker, an HHD Distinguished Alumni Lecturer, You've been featured in the College of Medicine's orientation and recently named as the Kay and Ernie Salvino Volunteer of the Year by the Penn State Alumni Association. What does this kind of recognition from your alma mater mean to you?
You know, it's so meaningful. I mean, it's nice knowing that my parents' investment in my college education is paying dividends still. That's really a good thing. But it's so meaningful. I feel like the recognition, which I'm so appreciative of, is acknowledging that the tools that Penn State gave me, I've maximized or attempted to maximize every tool that I've been given. So I tell my intern team on a regular basis, you're going to get out of this internship what you put into it. And I think that applies here. I think that I've gotten out of my career what I've put into it, but I was able to put so much into it because of everything Penn State gave me.
So in addition to everything Penn State has given you, you continue to give back to Penn State. You're a member of the executive board of the Penn State Alumni Association. Why do you choose to give back to Penn State as a volunteer?
I bleed blue and white. I love Penn State. I love being a Penn State alum. In a lot of ways, it's home. It's great to come back and just be a part of that, of the environment, the energy, the community. It's what we all know and helped kind of shape us. But what I love about volunteering for the Penn State Alumni Association in the capacity that I do is that I feel like I can contribute my best. I've developed and have learned a lot of things over my career. So to be able to leverage those to help 175,000 members of the Penn State Alumni Association and then the larger Penn State community, it's a great pay it forward opportunity for me. And that's the main reason why I give. But I'll also say that the Penn State Alumni Association is filled with some of the most tremendous staff. And so it's great to support them and to help them be more successful in a way that helps us all. And I will say, in addition to those things, Alumni Council is filled with some tremendous Penn Staters, and it's easy being in the room with them and working together on things. I think it's just a great fit for me, and I'm really glad to have the opportunity to give in the way that I do.
This is the Penn State Alumni Association's Coffee Hour. I'm Paul Clifford. I'm joined by Susan Robinson, star of the TED Stage with more than 1.5 million views on her TED Talk. All right, Susan, we're going to have a little bit of fun right now. I'm going to throw some quick hitters at you, and you just say the first thing that comes to mind, okay?
Okay, ready.
Favorite class at Penn State?
Outside of my major, logic. Inside of my major, health economics.
How about your favorite spot on campus?
Okay, just bear with me.
Okay.
It's the southwest corner of the intersection of Curtin and Bigler.
Okay.
And the reason why that is because if I'm standing there looking east, I'm looking towards Beaver Stadium. And the anticipation of just getting closer and the energy and the optimism that absolute frenzy is going to result by 112,000 people all at once, there's nothing like it. But then if I make a right-hand turn, I go downtown, which is kind of everything that I need to survive at Penn State. I can go out to dinner, I can buy shampoo, I can get my latest, greatest whiteout gear. If I make a 180, I'm now facing campus, which is everything I need to learn. And then if I turn again and I'm facing north, I have to say I still don't quite know what's north of campus. And so to me, it's sort of like, it's the unknown. It's what you can create. It's what you can discover. So it inspires a pioneering spirit.
All right. Your favorite building on campus?
Hints, of course.
How about your most unusual we are moment, right? We hear about people walking through airports or people hiking a trail in Vermont and a hiker in the opposite direction yells, "We are." What is your most unusual we are moment?
I don't know if if I have any unusual ones. I definitely echo those. I mean, I've traveled quite extensively, both domestically and internationally. And if I'm wearing something Penn State, it absolutely is the case. I don't think I have an unusual moment for We Are, but if I might share an unusual moment for We Want the Lion, in Beaver Stadium when I was a freshman, we were playing Syracuse, and the Syracuse orange mascot decided to jump into the Penn State student section because we were chanting, "We want the orange." And we very gently crowd surfed him and placed him up at the top, but he didn't have a costume by the time he got there.
That is a great story. So
Yeah.
favorite pizza place in the world? I know. I was gonna say, I know you live in New York City, and the world's best pizza is on every corner.
Yeah.
Just look at the signs in their window. So
Yeah, I mean, my favorite pizza is in Italy, truth be told. But if I'm in New York, traditional New York pizza is a place called Little Italy, half a block from City Hall. When I worked at the mayor's office, I walked by it every day. And that's a really delicious, like standard New York pizza joint. And then there's a brick oven pizza that was started by some like super fancy executive chef who just wanted to make pizza after a while. And it's on 6th Avenue in the high 20s between 27th and 28th, I think. Brick oven, delicious, all fresh ingredients. It's amazing.
now I just want you to know you've said a lot of amazing things so far this morning.
Yeah.
The most feedback that you're getting right now in the chat is about your pizza selection. A lot of hot takes on pizza. So
you know what? That's and as it should be.
Yes.
Exactly. Like there are important things in life.
How about your favorite Penn State away football experience?
My parents and I, this is quasi away for me. My parents and I went to the 2014 Pinstripe Bowl at Yankee Stadium, where Penn State played Boston College, and we won, which was great. And that was just really fun. It was fun to go to a bowl game with my parents. It was really great.
How about, what is your go-to karaoke song?
I have to admit, I don't do karaoke, but if I have on the Hamilton soundtrack, as a speaker, My Shot is one of the best possible songs because there's just so much going on.
Right.
But my favorite, and I'm sure to my neighbor's chagrin, because I will belt this one out, is You'll Be Back, the King's first song. It's just brilliant. It's totally in my key, and it's just so diabolically narcissistic that it's super clever, and it's a great song.
The whole role of the king in Hamilton is it's gold.
It totally is. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So you have to Google when we're done here, or go on YouTube and find Weird Al Yankovic singing all the Hamilton songs.
Oh, okay, brilliant.
It's also gold. So if you could have dinner with any one Penn Stater, who would it be and why?
Oh, this one is so hard. There's so many, there's just so many. And I have the privilege, I mean, outside of COVID, obviously, I have the privilege of having dinner with so many great Penn Staters regularly. I would say right now, if I could go to dinner with my interns, that I would adore that. If I could go to dinner with any of the Penn State astronauts, that would be amazing, just to, be one of those, one more person to say, what's it like to be in space? And then I also think it would be really cool to go to dinner with Susan Robinson, the basketball player, because we were on campus at the same time, and I got some of her phone calls, and I'm sure she got some of mine. And I think we could have a really fun conversation about our experiences, particularly when I was mistaken for her, without being seen, obviously.
Well, we're going to make that happen next time you're in State College. Susan Robinson actually lives in State College now. She works over at St. Joseph's Academy.
Oh, get out.
Yeah, absolutely. So we can absolutely make that hapen.
That's going to be amazing. I mean, the housing department messed up one summer. So I was diagnosed with my vision impairment, and then I still wanted to graduate on time. So I went through summer sessions to kind of catch up on credits. And one summer I was living in Nittany Apartments, and I walked in, and there were 3 really tall women. And I said, "Hi, I'm Susan Robinson." And they said, "No, you're not." And I said, "Yes, I am." And they said, "No, you're not." And I'm like, "Here's my ID. I'm Susan Robinson." And the housing department, they were 3 women on the basketball team. Right. And so the housing department must have just assumed that I was Susan Robinson on the basketball team. So it was me, Susan Robinson, and 3 women on the basketball team. It was just, we had a good time together.
That's a funny story. John Schaefer just mentioned that he had the very same experience with John Schaefer, the quarterback at Penn State when he was
Oh,
here.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah.
Your favorite Penn State sport?
Football, hands down. But a solid second is wrestling, but football's my game.
Okay. Here it is, Susan. The moment you've been waiting for.
I have my whole life. Yes. My whole life I've been waiting for this.
Your favorite creamery ice cream flavor?
Say it with me, Paul Clifford. Tea-berry delight.
Delight. Yes.
Yes. The best. And I'm going to start campaigning. It should be a year-round flavor because tea-berry is amazing. Right now, creamery ice cream, or the creamery has tea-berry delight only as a seasonal flavor in the spring. And I feel like just on an ethical decision, it's the right thing to do. But I can only imagine, I am one of many tea-berry delight aficionados and lovers, and we will ensure the sales. So I'm going to campaign.
Well, if you could hear it now, you could hear the rejoicing of tea-berry farmers all over northeastern Pennsylvania.
Yes.
So, Randy Houston saying, Susan, do you believe A, tea-berry is the best ice cream flavor, and B, the creamery should make it a year-round flavor? So you're already starting a movement here.
Yes, I think Randy and I should pair up and we'll make it happen. It's amazing. Denise, it's amazing. It's the best flavor.
Denise Corcoran is also on board. Wendy Egger, another northeastern Pennsylvania native, is on board. So you have the movement has started.
Yeah, we've got a crew. Absolutely. We're going to change the world with the tea-berry.
That's so funny. Oh, and now there's a hashtag Teamberry.
Yes.
Hashtag Teamberry. Okay.
I love it.
All right. Well, now that we've lost all control of coffee hour, why don't we go ahead and open it up if there's any questions? We have just a couple minutes left. Katie Dunn wants to know how many gallons of Tea-Berry Delight are in your freezer?
None, because I ate them all.
We talked about some like really important things in the first part of our conversation. and you're getting Tea-Berry and you are getting
pizza.
Pizza. Yeah, go ahead and
those
drop
are the
your
important
question.
Things.
Go ahead and ask your question in the Q&A box.
But to Katie Dunn's question, I will say that I ordered more half gallons of Tea-Berry ice cream than I will admit to, and I ate all of them. And truth be told, I felt very justified at the time because many of you may know that I'm planning a 1,500-mile bike ride to all the campuses in the Penn State system called Pedaled by Pride. And that was supposed to happen this October. Obviously, because of COVID, it's been postponed till next year. So I was doing some massive training, 90 minutes a day on the spin bike, plus runs, plus all sorts of other things. So at the point in time that I was scarfing down Tea-Berry ice cream like there was no tomorrow, I didn't have any real negative side effects on the sort of waistline situation, but I ate more Tea-Berry ice cream than I will admit to.
Excellent. Susan.
And actually, Randy Houston went to go buy Tea-Berry ice cream, and they were all out, and I'm convinced that I bought the last 2.
That's so funny. Wow. Denied him one of his guilty pleasures. As
I would have shared, but it was COVID.
So I'm looking through the names of the people who are here participating, and I am seeing that Michael Kirshner is on the line. Do you want to tell about how you and I got introduced to each other and the Michael Kirshner story?
Yeah, so Michael Kirshner, dear friend, and I'm so glad you're here, Michael. His son, Jeff, and I were TED residents at the same time. And so being the proud Penn Stater that I am, I went into TED saying, I went to Penn State. Did anybody else go to Penn State? Because we need to know each other. And Jeff says, well, I went to Michigan, at which point I'm like, not the question, and really, really unimportant. But he said, well, I went to Michigan, but my entire family went to Penn State. And I said, well, what happened to you? Why did you not get in? And so we sort of had a running joke about that, especially, actually, I don't remember if Penn State beat Michigan that season, but we were completely trash talking each other the whole time. And so he kept saying, you need to meet my dad. You need to meet my dad. And so I got to meet Michael. And one of the first things Michael said was, you need to meet Paul Clifford. He's the CEO of the Penn State Alumni Association. And a few months later, it happened. And here we are. Rest is history.
Absolutely. If it was the 2016 game, we did not beat Michigan. If it was 2017, we did beat them. So
yeah, so it was 2016, the fall of 2016, and I clearly have blocked that from my memory. 2017, I was then on council, and I do remember calling Jeff from Beaver Stadium when we won so that he could hear the cheering afterwards. So it was just, we're good pals like that.
We have had a lot of fun with Jeff over the years. So
yes, we have.
Some other questions coming in. Melanie Mazaleski, past president of the Blue White Society.
Hey, Melanie.
Wants to know, what are some skills or qualities you feel helped you to be successful in your career? What some of those things that helped you all along the way?
So some of the basics: organization, time management, willingness to learn. And then I'd say for me, you got to find your own strengths. Not everyone has the same strengths, and the ones that you bring to the table are uniquely yours and irreplaceable. And I think I've got a couple of those. I not having full vision. I really rely on my hearing, and so some people have said that I see more with my ears than some people do with their eyes. So it's just that way of processing information. And I seem to also have a way of communicating things, particularly verbally, in a way that gets people to understand really complex stuff and has some impact on changing mindsets and having influence over outcomes or decisions. Some people get very focused on, what they think comes next or 2 steps down the road. And I'm saying, well, what does this look like 20 years from now? And helping them to imagine those sorts of things. And I think those are some of the things uniquely mine, but built on a foundation of good skills that we definitely learn at Penn State.
So Susan, we are running out of time here. We have a couple questions. I want to get to all 3 of these questions really quick, but let's start with Sharonda. How did you make the decision to do a full-time position with your consulting business in full throttle, and how do you maintain contracts, and do you sleep? All those kind of that decision to go
Sharonda,
full-time.
happy to have a deeper conversation offline on this. How did I make a decision? The easy answer was I thought about doing something my own, launching my own business for a long time. When I left the pharmaceutical industry, it was because of a 22% worldwide workforce layoff of the company when it shut down a particular franchise that my work and my team's work was associated with. So at that point, it was a natural break to say, all right, I'm going to try my own thing now. And if it doesn't work, I can go back in. Business development, and no, I don't sleep.
Along the same lines, from Lauren Thumb, Lauren from Alumni Council.
Yeah.
What is your number 1 goal as the interim VP? I think what she's saying as the interim executive director.
Oh, for In Tandem?
Yes.
I would say my number 1 goal is to ensure that I'm helping create a sustainable organization.
Great. And then finally, Connor Pardo, Lion Ambassador.
Yeah.
Alumnus.
Connor, I want to pinch your cheeks.
He says, Susan, you're such an inspiration. I'm sure I'm not the only 2020 grad on the call. So if you were to give one piece of advice to a recent 2020 grad, what would it be?
Get up and conquer the day.
All right. Go get it, Connor. There's your word of advice from Susan Robinson. Susan, always a pleasure to talk to you. I
Ditto.
feel so
Thanks,
energized
Paul.
after our conversations, and I really appreciate you allowing us to share your story today with fellow Penn Staters.
Thanks. After our first conversation, that's actually what you said to me. I don't know if you recall that, but we met at a Le Pan Quotidian in Midtown Manhattan, and we chatted for about an hour, and you said, I'm so energized for the rest of my 2 days in New York.
Absolutely. I remember that. I remember that whole sequence well, and think about it often. So
Well, thank you so much for including me in Coffee Hour. It's been a lot of fun, and I'm glad to just have another way, especially as an extrovert during a pandemic, to connect with all of my Penn State peeps.
Yes. And thank you all for joining. Are you a member of the Penn State Alumni Association? If yes, thank you so much for your support. Your support makes programs like Coffee Hour and our virtual speaker series and all the great career services that we deliver to our alumni possible. We are powered by pride, and your support fuels that pride. If you're not a member, what are you waiting for? Join today and become a member of the world's largest alumni association. Visit our website at alumni.psu.edu. We hope to see you all next Wednesday when we will visit with Senior Counsel for Business and Legal Affairs at Complex Networks, better known as the 81st President of the Penn State Alumni Association, Randy Houston. Until then, thank you for all you do for the university, for the glory, and for the future. We are
Penn State.